Hello, Oscillator Sync here. This is a video about the Soma Lyra-8, and it's actually my third attempt at making this video. And usually, if I've failed to make a video that many times, it might suggest that I shouldn't be making a video about it because I don't gel or enjoy the instrument, but that's not the case with the Lyra-8, because this is one of my favourite electronic instruments of all time, but it's not like a lot of other instruments. Usually my approach for making a video is very systematic because you can take an instrument and break it down into its individual sort of systems, its individual components, and talk about how they feed linearly into one another. But you can't do that with the Lyra-8 because everything is sort of talking to each other at all times, so you can't take that approach. And so trying to take that approach didn't work. And then I tried to take a very exploratory approach, which was fun for me, but I think probably not fun for you to watch. So what I'm going to attempt to do in this video is talk about the instrument through four-ish different lenses and try and provide some tips, some technical tips, some creative ideas, and maybe some bit of exploration as well while we're here, to hopefully, if you've got a Lyra-8, maybe it will sort of address some pain points or give you some things to try that you haven't tried before, or spark some new ideas for ways of approaching the instrument. That's the plan anyway. We'll see if this video even comes out. In terms of the gear I'm using in this video, obviously the Lyra-8. I also have a specular reverb from GFI just out of shot to give us a little bit of stereo softening, because the Lyra-8 can be quite brutal and mono sometimes. So that will just soften things and make it just, I think, a little bit more pleasant to listen to. Okay, let's go for attempt number 3. Let's see how this goes. So this first section is going to be sort of the most technically practical part of the video, I think, and we're going to talk about tuning and balancing the instrument. So you're probably at least aware that the Soma 8 is an 8-voice instrument, with each of these touch plates representing one of the voices, and each of these voices can be individually tuned using its tune knob. For each cluster of 4 voices, you've also got a pitch knob which can control the overall pitching of the cluster of 4 voices, and Soma themselves in the manual suggest that somewhere around this sort of setting here gives you the most practical range for standard tuning, which is, I think, probably right. The voices can be freely tuned, but they do err towards their accuracy of tuning low to high. So although we can take this voice and take it very, very high, and take this voice and take it quite low, you will find it easier to tune these voices more accurately in the lower registers and these ones more accurately in the higher registers. That's not to say you have to do it that way from low to high. That's how I have it tuned at the moment, but not always how I have it tuned. Quite often I will approach it more like a sequencer, where each of these notes will be part of a melody, so perhaps I want to be able to play in order like this. But I'll tune them low to high to begin with anyway. One thing you might notice as we go low to high is that in this kind of default state of the instrument, with the distortion turned down, the delay turned down, and all the sharp knobs turned down, we naturally get brighter as we get to the top end of the pitches, and that can make these high notes kind of dominate a little bit over the low notes, and that can give the general voicing of the instrument a bit of it makes it feel like there isn't a lot of low end. There is actually a lot of low end, it's just the top end is more present in this sort of standard setup. So I want to talk about balancing the voices a little bit, and there's a couple of different ways you can approach that to make the bottom end feel as present as the top. The first and the most obvious, I think, way of approaching this is using the sharp control. So the sharp control for each cluster of 2 voices blends towards something closer to a square wave, which is naturally a more present sound. So if you have the voices tuned low to high, you might sort of stagger the sharp controls. A little bit, so that you sort of start quite sharp here and then sort of taper it off to the top end, which gives you a generally more balanced sound across the playing surface. So that's one approach you can take, but it's not the only approach that sort of works on the instrument. You can actually make use of the delay and distortion to also balance the instrument a little bit better, almost to the point where it feels like mix at 0 is not the initial state with the distortion. So with the sharps turned all the way down again, we're back to the sort of quite bright up at the top, but if we start to bring in a bit of the drive, you can hear that there's a natural warming that happens to the sound. So what we're doing here is not so much sort of emphasizing the low end, we're sort of homogenizing the whole instrument a little bit. Still a bit of sharpness, more presence up at the top, so you might want to combine the two, but you don't need to bring in quite so much of the square wave to get the same presence across the entire instrument. But also you have the delay as well, and a similar sort of approach applies, is that as you start to bring in the delay, there's kind of a phase relationship that happens. Just lengthen it slightly. Which kind of naturally balances the instrument. And this will also be dependent on the delay times as well. They'll be naturally darker at longer delay times. Obviously, there'll be more delay, obviously. But a combination of these 3 approaches usually works well to make sure that the bottom end doesn't get sort of overbearingly overwhelmed by the top end presence of the higher sounds. When it comes to playing the instrument, obviously we have these touch plates that we use to sound the different voices. And there are a number of different ways we can interact with these voices, and the fast switches are certainly part of the equation here. So I had them all turned down, which means that they respond quicker and they die off quicker as well. But with them set not on fast, we get a much longer decay. Which is much more in the sort of ambient world, which is lovely. The way I tend to play the pads depends on the type of performance, the type of composition. But one thing that I do that I haven't seen a lot of other people do quite so much is approach it with this kind of stroking movement sometimes, because when you have something on, have a voice on the not fast, the standard mode, you can actually sort of ping it in incrementally by just sort of progressively building up rather than kind coming straight in with a sort of a hard note, if you like. So you can bring things in almost like a tremolo type approach. And this also allows you to not sound the voice at its full volume straight away as well. But it very much depends on how the rest of the instrument is set up. And at the moment we're in a very vanilla setting, just so we can hear things a bit more obviously. But when you get to embrace some of the other aspects of the device, you can sort of decide more on your playing style. The other thing that I make use of a lot on this instrument, well, two things I'll mention. One is that we have this ability to hold voices by using the hold knob, which I'll get to in a second, but the hold knob is going to, at the very least, sound two voices at once. So I will also often use coins on individual voices if I need those particular voices droning. I've got euros because I've just come back from Super Booth. But let's talk about the hold, which is the other way of actually holding a note and sustaining a note. So turning up the hold control around sort of just before 12 o'clock will start to sound a voice that is not in fast mode. And beyond that point, we can increase the volume. And you should note that because of the voice architecture and also because of the distortion, we've only got a little bit on here, but it is there. Volume is also going to change the tone of the sound as well. Below this point, when it sort of comes in, you can also use the hold control to lengthen some of the envelopes as well. One thing that I use a lot though is the fact that when a voice cluster is set to fast, it won't come in until you're much further around the hold control. So past 12 o'clock generally. And again, the same thing with the volume stands here. And so the hold control I use a lot to sort of do progressive drones. The other way you can use this fact that the two fast settings affects where the hold is going to bring the voice in is by switching voice clusters in and out. So at the moment these are sort of tuned low to high, but we could, I guess they're not so low to high, and they are low to high, but it's not a massive jump. But you can get things held, and then you can use these switches to introduce sort of chord sequences. And it may be in this case that we might want to actually keep this very low note, root note in regardless, so we could use a coin. And then you have kind of like a way to do chord progressions by switching the different voice clusters in and out. Perhaps you'd want more delay there to hold things out a bit. And you can kind of use the fast switches and an appropriate hold position to do sort of like chord sequences, or interval sequences anyway. And then you still have your progressive drone in there as well. And some of these ideas will also be really useful when we talk about some of the other things that I want to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, so far we've got the instrument set up in quite a vanilla fashion. Essentially, we've got a conventional synthesizer with a slightly weird playing surface. But in the title here we have the word organismic, which is a really important part of the Lyra-8. What is meant by organismic really is that through cross-modulation and feedback primarily, the different parts of the instrument interact with each other, even when they're not necessarily sounding, but especially when they are being played together. And a lot of that happens through cross-modulation and feedback using this mod control, which we'll get to, but I do want to mention before then that there's a lot of interaction that can happen, of course, within the effects section. And in fact, it's kind of wrong to think about the delay and the distortion as effects that go on top of the sound. I think they are pretty integral to the way that the instrument is meant to be played, maybe. So we'll talk about the distortion first, and I think you should always have the distortion turned up somewhere. And the reason for that is that we can use the distortion to start to blend voices together and have them interact with each other. You can hear that those interactions between the volume of the voices brings in more harmonics, but also the intermodulation between the different voices frequencies also bring out almost ghost sounds, which is a standard thing with synthesizers and distortion. We hear almost new notes in there and rhythms, because distortion fundamentally will emphasize the things that are the same, and they'll also emphasize the things that are different within the frequencies, within the voices. It also becomes really interesting to play with the sharp control inside the distortion, because it has a quite a different vibe when it's sort of on its own to when it's pinging up against the other frequencies that are inside the distortion. A different kind of fizz. Can you hear that? There's almost a rhythm. And you can kind of hear it without the distortion. So much more obvious with it. And you know, you can approach the distortion in a couple of different ways, because you have a mix control, so you can go very, very high distortion but only have a bit of it in there. Or you can go low distortion and go pretty much full mix. And you get the DC voltage. Interfering. In interesting ways. which you don't hear with the distortion down. I think that's probably coming from the delay. Oh no, coming from the voices itself. Speaking of the delay, I will often play the instrument with the mix all the way up, because I think the sound of the delay is so, again, integral to the overall tonality of the instrument. Let's go on some longer. We're not doing any modulation at the moment, so it's just a static delay. I tend to like one time low and then one quite a lot higher, and I kind of like to allow it to get to that kind of crackly point, because there's a natural sort of crackle that comes from the delay chips. I think they're the PT karaoke chips. It sounds very much like other delays I have based on that. We can introduce a little bit of movement from the LFO as well, if we don't want things to be totally static. Which becomes, again, interesting when we have a lower mix. So yeah, I'm very much of the opinion that the delays and the distortion are an integral part of the voice of the instrument, so I very rarely will use it without them turned on. Just love that crackle. However, we should probably talk about the mod control and the feedback structure of the instrument. So I think the standard cross modulation use for the mod control is when you have the switch in its up position, and this basically has the voice cluster affected by the voice cluster mentioned up at the top here, and so we turn up the mod control here. Not a whole lot happens. Something happens up at the top because there's some feedback that happens right at the top of the knob, but not much happens. But now if we play one of the neighbouring 1 and 2 voices, it's going to affect this voice. That's not actually the way I use the mod knob a whole lot, actually, weirdly. What I tend to do these days is one of 2 things. And the first one I don't think is even, like, documented. I couldn't find it in the manual anyway. But if you have your LFO set in the middle position, and then you switch to the LFO mode here, even with the total feedback turned off, which we'll get to, this mod control does do something. And what's happening here is that it's been affected by all of the other voices, even though they're not sounding. And as you introduce the mod control on other voice clusters, again, even though they're not sounding, that interaction becomes more intense. And so you can build up these sort of complex relationships in the whole instrument that is quite different from what you get with the total feedback, which is much more extreme. Playing the voices still makes more of a difference than not. Find is that it tends to sort of lock into harmonies fairly easily. You can hear just get these quite complex interactions, but in a more controlled way than you would get with the total feedback. And just by virtue of it being set up this way at all, you get more sort of rich harmonics out of the voice as well. Voice there is quite almost trembly. I mean, listen to that. Almost like a modem gasping for life. Apologies to any dogs. You can hear me tuning that, affecting other things as well, which is cool. And the whole thing becomes very interactive in this setup, but in a way that is more controllable than the total feedback. I think the difference here is that we're only working with the voice clusters and not the overall output of the device. So yeah, this is my normal way of setting things up if I want sort of like a drone type performance, is to use this kind of cross mod without the individual voice clusters and just have the whole instrument kind of interact within the voice clusters. The other way that I use the feedback tends to be the total feedback, and we usually don't want things total feedback. But in the total feedback mode, with these turned down here, we're using the entire feedback of the instrument, including the output, to create cross modulation. And you can hear immediately that there's a tuning change, there's a difference in the richness of the voices. Purer sound, a sort of gravelier, richer sound. And you don't have to introduce a whole lot of mod. For things to get quite intense. The difference here is that there's weirdly less interaction with the unplaying voices. You'll almost certainly, as you adjust the mod, need to consider retuning. So if you're doing this in a performance, you need to be a little bit careful. But you can often find, you can hear that sort of swell it in as the feedback comes back on itself. You can find these places where you can return to with the high mod controls. But it becomes a much more exploratory way of working with the instrument. But even having these controls, sort of quite low, can just introduce richness in an interesting way. Or break things entirely at the top end. And you might find that you want to adjust the sharpness of voices with lower mods to accommodate the ones with higher. And of course, smashing the mod up high on everything is going to just freak the whole world out. But let's talk about one other facet of the instrument that maybe isn't discussed quite as much. So one thing I really like to explore on the Lyra-8, which I don't think necessarily gets quite as much coverage, is how you can approach it from a rhythmic perspective. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. And I want to talk about two sort of overarching approaches, but in a couple of different guises. We'll see how it goes. So the first sort of basis for introducing rhythm into the instrument is using the voices themselves, because especially these lower tuned voices, or when you have the pitch knob turned down, you can happily go down into clicks, right? And that's a rhythm of sorts. Now, what's interesting about what these clicks really represent is that we've got DC happening here. And that means that this is going to interact particularly strongly with voices when you then introduce distortion as well. You can already sort of hear it happening, but as we make use of the distortion a bit more, you can really start to hear it pinging. Isn't that cool? We can introduce other rhythms by trying to tune the two voices. Just isn't that fun? Adjusting the sharp control will also change the interaction, because it will change the wave shape. So even low down, you lose some of the clicks, but you still get that movement. Or higher up, much more obvious clicks. These clicks can be really interesting when it comes to interacting with the delay as well. And even without a sounding voice, you can sort of do pseudo carpless strong stuff. And then of course you could start modulating of the lowest tuned oscillators into the distortion. To get rhythmic ideas. It can be really, really fun. Especially with the delay involved as well. Now, of course, if you then also make use of the cross modulation as well with the DC, you can also do frequency modulation as well as that sort of pinging of the DC inside the distortion. Combine that with other channels which aren't doing the FM. Yes, I really like playing with the DC side of things inside of the distortion to get the rhythmic effects on the Lyra-8. But the more obvious way of doing this sort of rhythmic thing is making use of the hyperel effect. So let's take a look at that. So I'm a big fan of kind of Lyra-8 acid, as it were. And the way we do this is making use of the hyperel effect, which we haven't touched yet really. So if we're in the LFO mode for one of the voice clusters, and we have the hyper LFO in and or mode, and we start to bring up the mod control, we get frequency modulation, which is kind of like a little melody, right? And generally speaking, if you're in AND mode, you're going to get two different pitches. And if you're in OR mode, you kind of get four-ish. And you have two different LFOs here, so by making one fast and one slower, you can get different relationships between those different notes. And widening the mod control is going to widen the amount of notes you get. And because this is bipolar, it's sending the pitch down as well as up. And for lower tuned voices, you're going to go down so far that you're going to get into DC, which is how you get sort of like gaps in your melody as well. As you adjust the mod control, you're adjusting the overall width of what's happening. So if you have other parts of the instrument you want to harmonize it with, you're probably going to have to adjust the tune control as you go. The sync control introduces synchronization between the two voices, the two LFOs rather. And it's basically, I believe it's doing like frequency modulation. B is frequency modulating A, but what it essentially does is introduce a kind of soft reset almost. So that frequency B becomes kind of like your sort of main control, and then frequency A will sort of change how it has like figures within it. I can hear that the overall cycle isn't changing as I change frequency A, but the stuff inside of it is. But it's not like a hard reset, because you can kind of hear it shifting as it moves. Because of the voice architecture, as far as I can tell, you're never going to get two voices which are in tune otherwise to totally follow each other, but they'll be close. You get this kind of cool phasing sound with them, which is good in my opinion. So let's bring them both in. It's quite a cool groove. Try and get a higher pitched thing happening as well. Yeah. And it kind of excels at this sort of like kind of Pac-Man acid, I guess. And what you can do with other voice clusters is, if you've got something happening rhythmic on, say, 1 and 2, we could set 3 and 4 to be cross-modulated by this one, and you can kind of introduce additional harmonies. Almost like little tom hits now. Which will be fun as well. The other way you can introduce pitch movements into a droning voice cluster is rather than using the modulation on the voices themselves, you can use the modulation on the delay instead. This takes a little bit of patience to set up, I think, but it's sometimes really fun. So if we put this into LFO mode, and we want it on square mode, so it's hard moves. This usually works with sort of slower things. So you can find these places where you get like octave shifts. You can see it took a little while to get there. So that pitch movement isn't coming entirely from the delay rather than the voices. still use the other delay that's not been modulated to give you delay stuff. You can combine the two ideas as well, especially if you've got an octave happening up here. I think that's a really fun way to get rhythmic sounds, by combining the sequence in the delay and also in the voice. Use the Lyra-8 rhythmically to create Pac-Man acid. I implore you. I think, somewhat jokingly, my plan for this video is to entitle it Everything I Think I Know About the Lyra-8. But the reality is that it is an instrument which I keep learning things about. The trick with the LFO without the LFO mod was something that was fairly new to me. And I keep learning more about this instrument as time goes on, because ultimately it is an instrument designed, I think, primarily for exploration. And I could probably carry on just exploring it and finding new things in this video even, but there has to be a limit for a video, because I know my stuff is already too long. I guess one thing that I haven't really spoken about from a performance perspective, which is, don't be afraid to carry on moving with any of these patches. I think because the Lyra-8 is organismic and complex in its nature, that there is a temptation to find a good place and then only play the pads and not change things with the knobs because there's a risk of losing a good place. And there is always that risk with the Lyra-8. You know, it's an instrument that is very transient in its nature, but I think sometimes fortune favours the brave when it comes to finding interesting things. So I guess my last tip, which doesn't really come under any of the headings, is be mobile with the instrument and be brave. There's stuff that I haven't looked at or talked about in this video because this wasn't meant to be a full guide. I've never turned on the vibrato. We haven't played with the different routings for the cross modulation because they're not things that I use a lot. You know, I don't use the vibrato. I tend to introduce cross modulation. I don't tend to mess a lot with the voice-to-voice cross modulation anyway, which is why I haven't really talked about it that much. You know, I tried to make this video somewhat personal to the way that I use the instrument, because if you just want a rundown of the individual bits, you know, those videos already exist. So I think this is probably a good place to leave things. As good as any anyway. So if you enjoyed the video, as always, a like is really appreciated, and if you have any tips for using the Lyra-8, feel free to leave them in the comments for other explorers to explore. And then I guess other than that, I'll say thank you as always for watching. Until next time.